Greetings and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is going to be a great set of conversations we've titled The Future of Defense Summit. One glance at current headlines should make it clear why today's event really matters. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has upended the world order, and it shifted the national security landscape both here at home, but also all over the world. It's displaced and endangered millions while disrupting the global economy and added a lot of aggravation to supply chains that were already frustrating. Throughout the afternoon, we're going to explore most of our urgent defense needs and take stock of our greatest threats, including and beyond Russia. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Raytheon Missiles and Defense, for supporting today's conversations. Since defending America and our allies requires a multi-level, comprehensive approach, what are the Pentagon's top priorities today, and how are they anticipating future needs? In the same vein, what emerging technologies and innovations are most vital to securing our strategic priorities, both physical and digital? We're going to be putting these questions and more in front of our fantastic speakers, but first a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag, and hashtag's always more important, hashtag The Hill Defense. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience some trouble. Don't throw your computer through the window. Just push refresh and hopefully it will fix the problems. To discuss these pressing topics and more, I'm now honored to welcome my first guest, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks. Deputy Secretary Kathleen, it's great to see you again. I would ask you if you're having fun in your job, but I know that you get those 3 a.m. phone calls on a regular basis. But as we kind of right now, we're at this news where the President Biden has submitted his FY 2023 budget. Tell us what the Pentagon figures in the budget, and tell us why we should either be heartened or worried about what the Pentagon is in for.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's great to see you again, and thanks for having me today. Our budget request from the administration is for $773 billion. That's a little more than 8% more than we put forward in last year's, the fiscal year 2022 budget, and about 4% above what Congress authorized for the 22 budget. So either way you look at it, there's clear growth happening on the defense side. Why did we do that? We came in, like any administration, came into office looking ahead through a strategic lens, and we have just completed our National Defense Strategy review and put out a classified national defense strategy yesterday and briefed that up on Capitol Hill. And there's an unclassified fact sheet that's out there for the public to look at as well. And what we really found is that we need to make sure we are laser focused on the pacing challenge that China poses, that we are very attentive to the acute challenge that Russia is posing, and the events in Ukraine are foremost on our minds and really point to the importance of our allied approach, bringing all of the military and diplomatic and other tools to bear that we can, working together. And all of that framed up for us a key set of priorities for that defense budget in terms of our combat credible capability in order to campaign and fight and win if necessary. And then also investing in areas like cyber, space, AI, and other sources of innovation in terms of our small business community here in the United States. And then not to leave to last, our people. We gave a 4.6% pay raise to the military and civilians in this budget request. That's the highest it's been in 20 years. We've created more access to childcare, and we've gone after things like sexual assault. So it's a really robust budget, but I think fairly so. And I'll just end by saying we even put forward a very forward-looking climate change piece of this budget with $3 billion clearly tagged to our efforts to be resilient in the face of climate change.
Look, I don't know if you have one of the best jobs in Washington or one of the worst, but I know, you run one of the biggest, machines in the world, the operations in the world, and your job, I've known a lot of deputy secretaries of defense, been privileged that way, but, a lot of the folks don't understand the deputy secretary is not just a deputy. You have to merge resources and manpower and supplies to doctrine and objectives and policy and synthesize all of that. And I guess my question is, just learned that the National Defense Strategy classified form of that was released, but it had been delayed. And I guess the thing I had been worried about when the Biden administration came in is they came in with the pivot to Asia, some very tough meetings of Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, with Chinese officials. And it just seemed to be China all the time. And I wondered if the time whether Vladimir Putin was going to mock that and say, wait, look over here, look over here. Were we blindsided? Did we not see, to a certain degree, substantially enough what the resources and material and distraction that Putin was going to create? Did we create a condition that Putin could exploit?
Well, Steve, the first thing I would say is make no mistake, this Ukraine crisis is 100% the responsibility of Vladimir Putin.
Right.
The United States actually was quite prescient in and pointed out quite vocally, I think, as everyone now knows, what was coming in terms of Russia's intent with regard to Ukraine. And that's quite regrettably so. It's not something we wanted to be right about. But it's also not something that just happened in the last 4 months. You may recall as recently as last spring, there was a major Russian exercise that also looked to be building towards something like a potential invasion or something like other activities with other military aggression with regard to Ukraine. So we already knew as we were developing this NDS, of course, in the immediate, that there was this challenge with regard to Russia and Ukraine. And let's also not forget that in 2014, we already had the case of Russia having annexed Crimea and having undertaken these separatist and Russian-backed efforts in the Donbass. And so for 7 years plus, the United States has been investing itself in the posture that we have, largely air and land, but also maritime posture in and around our NATO territory, because we want to make crystal clear that our commitment to Article 5 and to defending every inch of NATO territory is ironclad. Our strategy absolutely took that into account, all the way from the goals that we set in terms of what we seek to defend and deter, and also in terms of the ways we're going to go about that, working closely with allies, having that combat credible force. A lot of the things that make us strong and capable against the pacing, the more advanced military challenge in many cases of China, also are highly applicable to the challenges posed by Russia. And if you look at the posture we have forward in Europe today, it's quite a robust force. And I think, as we always do in the department, we are constantly looking at our posture and constantly looking at strategy to refine and evolve that. So you may see some further refinements as we go, but none that I think will fundamentally shift where we are with our strategy.
I think if one is honest, if we were having this conversation a few years ago, there would have been a conversation if we were just really, bottom line, that there was a fatigue in the system. There was a fatigue in support, that we were engaged in forever wars, that we'd seen lots of people with multiple deployments. Have we moved beyond that now? I mean, you're giving a robust picture of our capabilities now. Have we worked through the fatigue of Iraq, Afghanistan, and others, and are we in good shape today? What
we would call readiness in the military, the readiness of our force is in pretty good shape. That said, we should not be sanguine about that need to constantly look at the goals that we have, the expectations that the public has of what the military can produce, and the pace and tempo at which we are keeping it. We see that for certain in our naval forces, for instance, and the tempo that they put out there. And so we're constantly looking at how do we adjust that connectivity of material, non-material, those readiness, how long is our equipment and maintenance, how well manned or how well fully fleshed are the units that we're putting forward. So we're constantly tracking all of those pieces. So my view is we're very ready. We have the rightful reputation of being the finest military in the world, but that takes effort day in, day out, and we should never take our personnel for granted. That's why this pay raise is so important, as well as all the other efforts that we have underway to make sure that our service members and their families and their equipment is well cared for.
A month ago, you released the Joint All-Domain Command and Control Implementation Plan. It's cool. It's called the JADC2, folks. So the JADC2, I'd like to let you know, which is the kind of Connect Everything initiative as I understand it. It sounds cool and interesting, sounds important. Where are we on that? But as a twist, I'm sort of interested in, China watches what we're doing. Is this something that gives us a qualitative edge on China or other peer competitors out there? And what are as you just said, keeping the best military in the world, the best, connected military in the world, what does it take to continue to stay ahead?
Well, our people are absolutely the key, and not just individually, but how we draw on human potential and create ingenuity with it. And what JADC2, as we call it, really points to is this advantage area that the United States has traditionally been able to count on in an era that is now shrinking, which is being able to have decision advantage, the best information, the best intelligence, but the best information all source, timely, and able to fuse that information and act on it. And the people really matter on that last piece, the ability to act and synthesize, information. So JADC2 has been at the heart of how we think about the way we fight, both in the past, in former iterations, informationized warfare, if you will. The Chinese certainly think about their approach to that. We have seen the Russians really be challenged with that in bringing together their joint force and having good domain awareness. So we know the advantage that it can bring. Now the key is to make sure we can leverage the best of technology that's out there and get out of our own stovepiping way to bring data together, to leverage AI, and to make sure we have the cloud and computing capabilities we need to have information in front of decision makers quickly and be able, as I said, to act on that decisively. That's at the broad strategic level. Down at the tactical level, the same basic principles apply. We want to be able to get that tactician, whether they're in a tank or in an artillery unit or out at sea, to have the information in front of them and be able to act as quickly as possible, getting the sensor of what they're seeing to the shooter, if you will, of how they then employ force, connected as quickly as possible.
Let me just ask you a personal question as we close out. You used to work for a former Deputy Secretary of Defense. You worked for John Hamre at the Center for Strategic International Studies. For everyone, John Hamre served during the Clinton administration, as almost 30 years ago. During that period, and I'm just interested in how the map, the strategic focus, and the toolkit you have has changed. I'm sure you've talked to John, before you came into this job. He probably gave you some advice and counsel, on how to not worry about the wrong things, how to worry about the right things. I'm just interested if you've reflected at all on how the position you have today has changed, if it has at all, since the time that John Hamre was there as Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Well, first of all, John Hamre is the greatest of Americans, and I was so privileged to work for him at CSIS, as you point out, directly. And then I'll just say, without aging myself too much, indirectly back at the Defense Department when he was the Deputy Secretary. So I was able to really see how he did the job at the department, and as well as multiple other deputy secretaries of defense. One of the, I guess I'd say, advantages of having been a career employee years ago is I have seen different deputies and different secretaries organize all these aspects that you pointed out in your introduction that are so important to synchronizing in the department. And John is the best of the best at that, and certainly was as deputy. So one of I'd say the biggest issues really are continuity and not change. And the biggest issue of continuity and what makes a deputy anywhere successful is that relationship with the secretary, in my case, or your principal, and making sure that you just have a very strong working relationship, communication advantage. And that is absolutely true for me with Secretary Austin. He's a fantastic secretary, and we have a very strong communication channel, good lines and roles and responsibilities. And that makes it very easy for me to do my job. That was true when John was the deputy secretary, and it's certainly true today. We have more data connectivity, as I pointed out before. We have better computing power, but at the end of the day, it's about the people. It's about understanding what incentives shift organizations to move in the direction you want them to move. And that's what we're really about at DoD. It's about defense innovation and how we get concepts and capabilities tied together to meet the objectives the American people are putting out for us.
Well, Kathleen Hicks, Deputy Secretary of Defense, good friend, thank you so much for taking us, behind the curtain a little bit so we understand how you're approaching many of these evolving national security challenges to the United States. We really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve.
Earlier today, I had a chance to speak with Congressman Mike Rogers from Alabama, who serves as the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Here's my conversation with Congressman Mike Rogers. Congressman, so great to see you today. Thank you for joining us. I think the big issue of the day is, what are America's stakes in the crisis going on in the Ukraine, Russia's invasion? What do we have to get right ourselves as we watch President Zelensky and the Ukrainians fight for their own democracy and freedom? What are we doing what we should be doing?
Unfortunately, we haven't been doing what we should be doing for a while. Me and Senator Inhofe, our part of the Senate Armed Services Committee, started urging the administration last fall, to send lethal aid to Ukraine to better prepare them for what we saw was imminent. And the administration just refused to. They were so concerned about escalating instead of deterring, which is what we believe arming the Ukrainians has done. And now we're in the situation we're in. They're trying to get lethal aid to them now when they really needed it months ago. And that's unfortunate. What I regret is that the president is far too concerned about escalation when he should be flipping the script and making Putin escalating against the West.
Right now, we see that the Russians have apparently said that they are interested in, some new equilibrium. They've even said that Vladimir Putin is willing to meet President Zelensky after a draft agreement of a peace deal is done. They said they were going to drastically reduce their forces around Kiev and another major city in Ukraine. We haven't seen evidence of that. We've heard rumors that another negotiating team from Ukraine may have been poisoned. So what would be your advice to President Zelensky about the current peace overtures from Russia and the possibility of meeting Putin?
I wouldn't trust anything Vladimir Putin suggests that he's willing to do. If I were President Zelensky, I would keep fighting as ferociously as they have been fighting until such time that Putin himself proposes something that's acceptable to Zelensky. And in my view, that should be nothing short of full withdrawal from the country, not just the western part of the country. I think Putin is hoping for a free-saving withdrawal back to just keeping the Donbass. And I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think that Zelensky should. I don't think the West should reward his bad behavior by allowing him to keep that region.
And the other day, I talked to Senator Bill Cassidy, and he said, "Steve, I wouldn't mind if a couple of Ukrainian tourists wandered into a NATO base and accidentally flew out those MiGs and took them off." He says that would be a very good scenario for us. And it just seemed to be whether he was serious or not, it was a creative way to look at how to transfer capacity to the Ukrainians to deal with their own security. We're doing that with Stinger missiles. We're doing it with other sorts of weaponry. And I'm just wondering where you are on the MiG issue and what weapon systems could we still help provide the Ukrainians that we've not? I know you've been very specific in some of your calls to President Biden.
Yeah, for a variety of air defense systems. But also, the thing with the MiGs, I have talked with General Walker about that. And the fact is, if we were going to do that, we should have done that prior to the conflict. The did not have the capacity to sustain those MiGs. If we flew them in there, they'd be good for one flight and operation. But you got to have each one of those planes comes with a whole crew that it takes to sustain it. Those are old. They have a lot of parts issues that Ukraine doesn't have. So not the solution. I know everybody seems to think that's a quick resolution, but it's really not. And that's not the point. platform, and that's coming from the Yukon commander. So I have to defer to his judgment on that. But there's a variety of things that we can give them to help them create their own no-fly. They won't have to have us to do it, but we just have to have the will, and the president so far has done it. We have I think it's Slovakia that is the S-300 that they're willing to transfer immediately as long as we give them something to backfill. And the administration has been looking around for 2 weeks for something to backfill, and that's just not showing the kind of competence that you would expect from the United States military when there's a very capable air defense system we get to 2 weeks ago. So it's just, I've been very disappointed in the way this administration's handled this, solely because they're worried about escalatory behavior.
Now, we've just seen the president's budget come through, and there's a 4% increase in the Pentagon's budget allocation from the president's side of things. Do you think that budget reflects the kind of national security and national defense priorities we ought to have in place? Is it missing key provisions that you think ought to be shifted? What's your view on the president's budget right now?
Yeah, I'm very disappointed in the president's budget. The fact is we're living with almost 8% inflation, and that's today. It's going to get worse as this year goes forward. His budget is basically 4% increase, so it doesn't even keep up with inflation. Every dollar increase he has, and to his credit, he proposed a little bit of an increase. It's going to be consumed by inflation. It's not going to be able to allow us to do anything in the way of modernization, much less provide the kind of aid that we need to for Ukraine. So I expect to see the Congress come back like we did last year with a much more robust budget proposal. I think you've probably seen the letter that me and Senator Inhofe and all the Republicans sent to the administration calling for a 5% overinflation budget increase. And we think that will be a responsible budget that will help us not only meet our obligations in Ukraine, but continue to pivot our focus to China and trying to prepare for our modernization efforts that are so desperately needed. In no place more than in the triad. We can't keep deferring that modernization. We've got to get after it.
One of the interesting things that happened is, like, beginning of March, the National Defense Strategy report was delayed, and it was delayed in part because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you look at the beginning of the Biden administration, you had Defense Secretary Austin and Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan meeting a lot with Chinese officials. And the whole mantra was pivot to Asia. Let's look at what resources we need on China. And I was worried at the time about Vladimir Putin wanting to taunt Biden and say, hey, remember us over here in Europe. So I guess my question to you is, in the past, when Kissinger was very famous saying, hey, if you're not going to take both these, key players on at the same time, have we, in our steps, created opportunities in a sense for China and Russia to work together? Should we be trying to divide them, or do we need to basically challenge them both simultaneously?
We have to create them both simultaneously. I think that Putin is going to find out over time that China is somebody he can trust either. And if China doesn't know they can't trust Putin, then they haven't been paying attention. My view about what's happened is I kind of look for silver linings in every bad thing that happens. And the fact is that the invasion that Putin has caused has focused the mind of the world on national security. You see what it's done to NATO. Biden says he brought NATO together. No, it was Putin that brought NATO together. That invasion happened in 1949. And you look at Germany alone, to get them to pay their 2% of GDP toward defense. They did it like that once this invasion started. But not just as it focused the importance of national security on our Europeans' minds, it has our populace as well. I think the world, but our populace is very focused right now on national security issues. They're outraged by what's happening in Eastern Europe. And I think it helps position us to do what we've got to do to get after the threats that we face. Anybody that's kept up with me knows that I've spent a lot of time in Europe over the last decade. as I was chairing strategic forces. And I was always concerned during the Indo-Pacific that we were going to turn too much attention away from Europe. So I don't think that's a concern anymore. I think you're going to see us redistribute a lot of our manpower in Europe to the eastern flank with permanent basing in Poland and Romania and in the Baltics. And I think that's going to be good for our relationship with our NATO allies. I think it's going to be good to deter any future aggression from Putin. And it's going to be good for our long-term posture as we then simultaneously start this pivot to focus on China's global aggression. China's not just aggressive in the Pekong. This Belt and Road Initiative they got around the globe is positioning them for both economic and military global power. And we've got to acknowledge that and start to prepare to defend against it and to deter their aggressive behavior. I'm of the opinion that China thinks they can do to us what we did to the Soviet Union. You go back to Reagan's tenure, and he just started a significant defense buildup until we finally just broke the Soviets. They couldn't keep up. And that's what, in the beginning, brought down the Soviet Union. I think China thinks they can just spend us into oblivion, and I think they're going to be mistaken.
I want to just conclude with something you've been working on for years. There's probably no member of Congress that's been more of an advocate for the Space Force than you. And I just want Americans that are listening to this right now to understand how the Space Force is going to fit into our security, where you see it's going, and what's it going to do?
That's a great question. Most people don't understand that the Space Force is about satellites. It's not about sending Captain Kirk and people. It's about satellites. And what we think about the Space Force is those satellites are our eyes and ears, and sometimes our voices, our ability to communicate. And we have been heavily dependent on them in our daily lives. People don't realize it, that smartphone they got using a satellite, they're using the traffic signal they're using government satellites. GPS is the population. It's people get to use it, but it's not up there to help you find a restaurant. It's up there to guide missiles and position troops and a whole host of things that we need militarily. So I want people to understand that we have to be very agile and fast when it comes to the evolving technological advances in satellite technology. The Russians and the Chinese both understand that that's a game changer, being able to maneuver and fight in space. We've got to be very fast. And that's the whole reason we took space out of the Air Force, is so it could develop a whole culture of space dominance. And to do things faster, because unfortunately the Air Force, just like the Navy and the Army, they move at the low pace when it comes to modernization and acquisition. Space can't be that way. So we're determined to keep the Space Force lean, relatively small, well-funded, so that we have the kind of robust capabilities in space that we're going to need, because it is a warfighting domain and it will become more and more important over time.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch how it evolves, and I'm sure you're going to be very involved with that. Well, Congressman Mike Rogers from Alabama, ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, a big voice on many of the national security issues around the world today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm greatly excited to welcome my next guest, who is joining me in studio. Christine Wormuth is Secretary of the Army. She has previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, and she's here today to discuss the people, the strategies, and technologies behind the Army of the future. Secretary Wormuth, it's really, really great to have you here in person. It's nice to be doing these things in person again, so thank you.
My pleasure.
Look, I want to just start out with news that's unfolding, and you know strategy, you know resources, manpower, etc. But what's unfolding in Ukraine and the terrible tragedy there, I remember when the Biden administration started off, it started off with an Asia focus. It started off with the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, having some rather, tough meetings with China and talking about the pivot to Asia. Do you think that was a mistake in the sense that it gave an opportunity to Vladimir Putin, said, hey, remember us over here in Europe?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think we still have to keep our eye on China as the pacing challenge. And I think, the United States as a leader in the international community needs to be able to walk and chew gum. So I don't think we took our eye off the ball there. And frankly, I think, Vladimir Putin went into Ukraine, obviously, in 2014. So I think there were plenty of folks who were paying attention to Russia as an acute threat as well.
Now, there are players in the world, and some of them happen to be in Russia. We saw this with what happened in the 2016 election, and others that are playing in new areas, cyber war. We've seen the weaponization of things like immigration between Belarus and Lithuania. A lot of new dimensions to conflict that were not in a traditional NATO or military playbook. And we're talking about the Army of 2030. What are the dimensions of these new hybrid dimensions of conflict that we're preparing for and thinking about? How is what we're seeing unfold in the world shaping the decisions and deployments you're making?
All of those dimensions are really core to our transformation to the Army of 2030. And our sort of centerpiece concept is called multi-domain operations, precisely because it's not just about the traditional warfighting domains of air, land, and sea. You now have space, you have cyber, you have information. And for example, one of our new formations that we're developing is called the Multi-Domain Task Force. And it is designed to be able to bring together not just the traditional kinetic effects, but also to be able to leverage information, cyber, and space.
I think 20 years ago, if you were to kind of spend some time with the Chinese literature looking at us, they were worried about our own revolution in military affairs, taking technology and information systems and equipping the soldier, creating smart systems throughout this system. So we've had 2 decades of that, and I think it's been pretty impressive when you see U.S. forces. A lot of that has been achieved. As you look out 20 years from now, and you're going to increasingly, what does a soldier look like in 2030? How has that changed?
Well, I think the soldier in 2030 is going to be sort of the middle step to a more complete transformation that will probably happen in 2040. So a lot of the equipment, what we call kit for soldiers is in 2030 is going to be similar to what they have today. But I do think you'll have things like wearable technologies, for example. So we are working on a headset called IVAS that will allow soldiers to be able to, see an environment, to operate and train in a virtual environment. So I think you'll see our soldiers using that kind of equipment. I think you'll see us leveraging data more and bringing some robotics and artificial intelligence assisted technologies to our soldiers. And then, by 2040, I think you'll see a more fundamental change.
I've had a privilege to interview many of your predecessors and colleagues in the U.S. national security space. And one of the things that I've learned is that we have to make bets about the future. We have to look at complex weapon systems today that are really going to perform into the future. Sometimes we get those bets right, sometimes we get them wrong. And some of the lament that I hear from people is that we get stuck with having to pay for things that may not be fighting the wars of tomorrow, but still a little bit yesterday. How do you navigate the North Star in that kind of dimension when you're thinking about the expenditures? I'd love to hear what you think about the budget that's just come out. Is it designed to pay off these legacy systems that are about conflicts of tomorrow, of yesterday? How do we orient it towards the conflicts of tomorrow?
Well, on the budget, I feel quite good about the budget that the Army has this year.
How much did you go for?
We've got $178 billion in our top line, and the great part about that is it's going to allow us to maintain our modernization momentum. And we are pursuing a modernization program that is a once in 40 years kind of very ambitious effort. Like you said, we're placing a lot of bets. But I think one thing that's helping us try to, make smart bets, if you will, and navigate the uncertainty of that landscape is, first of all, we're pursuing something called Project Convergence, which is really kind of an experimentation series that we have where we're using our soldiers and operating and experimenting with a lot of these new technologies to try to figure out which ones really have the most promise. And we're doing that with our sister services, with the Air Force, with the Navy, with the Marines, the Space Force. And then the second thing is we are leveraging a lot of new authorities that Congress has given us to allow us to develop and acquire new systems more rapidly. And we're really fundamentally pursuing a soldier-centric design agenda, so that we are getting prototypes out into the field, letting soldiers work with them, give us feedback. And that's a very different way of developing weapon systems than the Army has pursued in the past.
I know that cyber is a huge part of what you're doing, and I always wonder, and I know this is going to be layman terms in this, I don't know how you talk about it in the military. I always worried a little bit like maybe America is running into a problem that the British had when they were fighting the colonial revolutionaries, that they're well organized, they know their doctrine, they know their units, but they were fighting, U.S. soldiers in the woods and swamps, the early colonial folks. And when I think about cyber, and I think about the folks that are the hackers, the folks that are often engaged in, perhaps it's a movie depiction, but I often wonder, do we have the environment that attracts cyber brilliance to defend this nation, to think about it, that is as creative and nimble as some of the folks I see sometimes in Eastern European shops?
Well, we are certainly trying to create that environment where we can attract the best talent. And, one of the things that we offer, obviously, in the Army and in the military is the opportunity to work with NSA, for example, where they're really getting to do some of the sexiest issues, on the cutting edge of cyber and cyber offensive and defensive operations. And our Army Cyber Command is, offering those kinds of opportunities for soldiers. But we're also, we've developed something called the Software Factory at Army Futures Command, where we're finding soldiers all across the Army who aren't necessarily, their day job in the Army isn't focused on cyber, but they happen to be terrific coders. And we have found those people and are really using them to build apps and programs for us that can be used on the battlefield. So I think that, combined with just frankly the fundamental opportunity to serve the nation and have that sense of purpose, is something that allows us to attract a lot of great talent.
Madam Secretary, I know this is a hard question, but I guess I'm going to ask you it sort of in the inverse, which is, how is the Army today in terms of dealing with people where they are, the human part of this? We see reports about sexual violence. We have seen the ups and downs, which I'm sure is very hard for those service people who are transgendered. Having had a light switch on, you're wanted at one moment, you're not wanted in the next. We've seen the stress from suicides, the fatigue in the system. And I guess after talking to a lot of U.S. senators who are concerned about reporting authority and how to get this right, so I guess it's really a human question. What are we not doing that we still need to do on the side of mental health, supporting people where they're at, and not having a large gap between military service and all of the colors and flavors that looks like in our military and the rest of our society? Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the big things that we are doing is focusing on prevention. We have done a lot, and a lot of the reforms that have happened in the last couple of years have been about, taking those kinds of crimes out of the chain of command and having them be handled by trained lawyers who are really specialists in that. And I think that's an important reform. But what we're really trying to do is focus on preventing those harmful behaviors in the first place. And part of what we're doing there is trying to make sure that our soldiers and their families have access to behavioral health resources, because that's, when it comes to things like suicide prevention, that's really key. But one of the things that we're challenged by, frankly, Steve, is the fact that our country has a shortage of behavioral health specialists at exactly the time when the demand for that nationwide, with everyone coming out of the pandemic, is at probably a historic high. But we are really trying to emphasize people first. Our units take one day a month to really have commanders focus on mental health, on prevention, on wellness with all of the soldiers. We're doing a lot to try to make sure that our soldiers and families are cared for and feel respected and safe in their workplaces.
Look, I'm going to ask you, finally, a few weeks ago, you gave what were very prescient remarks about where this Ukraine crisis was going to go. You saw it getting much, much worse. You saw Russians likely targeting civilians and hospitals, and we saw what happened with the theater in Mariupol and others. And I guess my question to you now is, as you look forward, one of the big questions that's out there is, how prepared are we with a real playbook, which I think scares people to think about, if Russia were begin to go after some of the planning and supply and support in Poland? What happens if there is a a tactical nuclear explosion somewhere that leads to radiation and materials coming into one of our NATO allies. I think one of the questions out there is, what's the solvency of our response? How prepared are we, and where do you think this is going?
Well, I certainly think we have to prepare and plan for those kinds of possibilities. And, you know, we have a long history of planning for operating in a chemical, biological, even nuclear, you know, environment, as terrible it is to contemplate that. So those plans are in place. Our soldiers have those kinds of equipment for those kinds of situations. But I think that's why, you know, so much emphasis is being placed on defending every inch of NATO territory and putting a very strong deterrent posture forward. And, you know, we've got 40,000 Army troops alone in Europe to make very clear to President Putin that there are lines that can't be crossed.
You know, I would just say finally, you know, I used to ask people what kept you, keep you at night. What's the 3 a.m. call you get? Is there a night you don't get a 3 a.m. call?
Well, luckily I'm on the man, train, and equip side of the equation now, as opposed to managing the daily crises. But certainly this is probably the most dangerous security environment that I've been in 25 years of working in national security. So there's no shortage of things to keep you awake at night.
Well, Christine Wormuth, Secretary of the Army, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
It's now time for the Sponsor Perspective session of the program. Please welcome Wesley Kramer, President of Raytheon Missiles and Defense. He's in conversation with Jason Jedlinski, Publisher and General Manager of The Hill. Over to you, Jason.
Wes, thank you for being here with us. Very excited to talk to you about Raytheon's work with hypersonic weapons. I know your team accomplished a critical first flight test last September. Tell us a bit more about that success.
Well, Jason, thanks so much for having me with you here today. We're incredibly proud of our team. So in conjunction with DARPA, we've been working on a program called the Hypersonic Air-Breathing Weapon Concept. And we successfully flew that in September of last year. You know, it represents a huge step forward to be able to do a hypersonic flight. It's been a long time since that's been accomplished in the United States, and this being done as part of a weapons concept is a big deal, not only for DARPA, but certainly for the Department of Defense. You know, and if we step back and look at this a little bit, there's two main technologies kind of in the hypersonic regime. And one is the boost glide, where you fly up out of the atmosphere and then come back down, a glide vehicle that bounces along. Whereas this is actually powered by a scramjet engine. So an engine that essentially does supersonic combustion and flies in the high reaches of the atmosphere. And that's the difference here. Think of this as a really fast cruise missile. And that's the concept that we demonstrated here. So incredibly proud of the team for doing this.
I'm sure a lot of learning took place during that test in September. Any lessons learned that really stand out in particular for the team?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the number one thing that I saw was, to me, this was a real validation point of digital design and digital engineering. And this is something that we've been talking about for many years. And I think, you know, all companies, Raytheon included, have made significant strides forward in this. But this really represented the culmination of all of that coming together. And we actually designed this in a digital environment. We modeled its performance in a digital environment. And when we flew it, the correlation that we saw between the digital environment and our predicted flight and what we actually saw in the flight test was absolutely phenomenal. And to me, it demonstrates the power of digital design. And not only that power to go faster, to be able to design in a digital environment and not have to, you know, build hardware all along the way, but probably more importantly is that ability to streamline test. I look at so many programs today of how much time and money is spent in testing when we're really trying to go faster and field a capability. You know, if we can do that in a digital environment and then anchor the model with just a few flight tests, it really is powerful. And it really then looks towards the future. And I think that, to me, was the biggest lesson learned out of this flight test.
It sounds like the digital design, in addition to being efficient, gives scientists and researchers predictable results, which is always a good thing in these cases.
Yeah, it allows you, there's no such thing when these complicated things of a first pass success on every design, right? But what you're trying to do is how do you increase the cycles of learning and do that faster? And that's what digital design really allows you to do, is to incorporate lessons learned, incorporate things at any level in your supply base, and to be able to then incorporate that into the design and to do that rapidly.
Right. What was one of the biggest challenges the team faced while developing this prototype?
Well, the biggest challenge, and not just for this, but for any hypersonic program, the biggest challenge is how to manage the thermal stresses. When you've got something flying through the atmosphere in excess of Mach 5, that's your biggest threat, is the thermal effects. And not only on just the aeroframe itself, the air structure, but at these kinds of temperatures, you get into, exotic metals. You have to worry about how things, actually will deform under stress and heat. And then when you think about how do you put sensors and how do you create things, whether it's radio sensors that can actually be able to operate in this environment, or to create apertures that they can see out of in this environment, that's the real challenge of bringing all that together. And for us, one of the key things is how do you marry that thermal model with your mechanical aero model, with your performance model. And it's really, you have to find an optimization of all of those in order to get to your design solution. So to me, that's the biggest challenge in this flight regime.
Yeah, there's little room for error at the intersection of all three of those areas, for sure. I know this hypersonic air-breathing weapon concept, HAWK, is an offensive program, but at Raytheon, you're also working on defensive programs. What can you tell us about some of those?
Yeah, Jason, that's a great question. And, from my perspective, there's probably a bigger challenge on the defense side than there is on the offensive side. And we can use a great analogy is ballistic missile defense, right? If you look at what we have spent as a nation over the last several decades, in order to protect our country against a rogue ballistic missile attack, what you recognize is that on the offensive side, you only have to get lucky once. You can put together something, you can build a concept, and you can go fly it, and maybe one will get through the defenses. On the defensive side, when you're playing defense, you have to be perfect. And in order to be perfect, it means you have to have redundancy. You have to be able to not only detect these launches, you have to be able to track them through their entire time of flight. You're going to have a layered defense system to be able to defend against them, because you can't always count that first layer of defense is going to be successful 100% of the time. So when you start to look at the challenges around defense, you realize how great it is. And I use the analogy of ballistic missile defense. And, by definition, a ballistic missile, once it goes ballistic, it has a predictable flight path, whereas a hypersonic weapon can have a very unpredictable flight path. And so when you think of how that complicates that targeting solution, that just starts to touch the tip of the challenge of what the defensive side of this is for our country.
Definitely the stakes are high, and I think we're all well protected with Raytheon and its innovation and the digital design you talked about, watching the front. Anything else you want to add about this program or other work at Raytheon?
I think that was clearly the topic of today, is to talk about what we're doing in hypersonics. As you mentioned, it's not only the offensive side, it's the defensive side. And we certainly see with the world events that are going on that, the importance of being able to, work with Congress, work with the Department of Defense, and really bring a whole of country kind of solution to address these threats that exist in the world, and to ensure that we always have a way to protect not only the United States, but our allies around the world. So proud to be a part of this team, just one of the many teams we have, but, a truly significant accomplishment, and proud for what they've done.
Well, great. Thank you, Wes, for joining us and for your support of this program about the defense industry. And we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks, Jason. Pleasure to be here with you today.
Thanks again to Wesley Kramer and to Raytheon Missiles and Defense for supporting today's really cool and interesting conversations. Thank you, Jason and Wes. And I'm now joined by Navy Secretary Carlos Del Toro, who has served in numerous positions, and completed several tours of duty at sea during his decades-long naval career. He joins us today to discuss how the United States Navy is strengthening maritime dominance and bolstering crucial relationships with allies and partners. Secretary Del Toro, it's great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us. Look, I'm obsessed with the Navy and trying to understand how we compare us versus others and, kind of get all this stuff in the right package. And I'm just going to start out and ask you on that question about maritime dominance. If you look at China, and I'm not telling folks China is only threat. There's a lot of dimensions of China. But one thing they seem to be really good at is building naval vessels. And right now, if you look at the number of naval vessels that China has put out in the Pacific, my understanding is they've got about 360. We have about 297. They're slated to have 400 by 2025. Do you worry about us maintaining a pace of naval vessel presence? And is there a difference between quantity and quality in what we have versus what they have? Oh, you're muted, Mr. Secretary.
Steve, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here with you and viewers this afternoon. And yes, the Secretary of the Navy worries about everything. And certainly, you said that China is really good at building ships. I would argue differently. They're probably not that great at building ships, but they build them in great numbers. And that's a marked difference as well, too. The quality of our ships and the capabilities that we have on our ships significantly outpace the quality and the capabilities that they bring to bear as well, too. And I think that is important for the comparison of how many ships we have in each other's navies. It's really not just about the ships. It's about capacity, it's about capability and the combined lethality that it actually brings in deterring our aggressors from what they want to accomplish.
The other, big piece of news that we're at right now is sort of looking at the broad multi-dimensions side of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and watching the heroic, I have to just call it heroic and, I shouldn't say surprising because maybe our intelligence should have been better, that we would have expected such resilience in Ukraine. But I know you've been outspoken and say, hey, there are a lot of perhaps underestimated dimensions of the Russian Navy, not Soviet yet, but the Russian Navy and submarine force, and that there are other maritime dimensions to conflict that we need to be taking seriously.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Steve, and I don't think that we should necessarily underestimate the Russian Navy predicated on the underperformance of the Russian Army. There are two distinct services, and the Russians have invested a lot in their submarine undersea capabilities, and so it's important for us to make sure that we invest in order to maintain and exceed the pace at which Russia invests in its submarines as well. And also its surface combatants. As we see now, we have more Russian surface combatants in both the Black Sea and the Mediterranean than we've seen in a long, long time. And it's important for the U.S. Navy to be able to deter that in every possible way. And we are doing that with the number of ships that we have in the Mediterranean currently.
Mr. Secretary, I don't know if you heard my conversations with the Deputy Secretary of Defense and others, but I've been having conversations all week, actually, where, I think it's come to finally an appreciation that what we used to call a phone, which we carry around, is no longer a phone. It's a computer, it's an interaction with the web, it's, a database, an old Rolodex, all of these other dimensions of what a phone used to be. A car is no longer a car. It's also an information system. But I'm wondering, whether or not we need to think, about the nomenclature of how we think about ships and weapon systems and others. And as we kind of move into a world of AI, quantum computing, and other dimensions, whether or not, I know we need ships and naval vessels, and I was just kind of counting numbers, but what are these new next generation technological qualitative dimensions of warfare that you're helping to steward forward?
Well, that's exactly right. And as Secretary of the Navy, it's incredibly important to obviously build the appropriate capacity to meet the threat and deter China and Russia and any other aggressors around the world. But the capability that goes on those platforms is equally important. And as we look at
So we may have just lost Secretary Del Toro. The Pentagon has very hardened and very thick walls, so we'll have to see whether we can bring him back up here right now. But to my point earlier, and just to share with the audience my own editorial perspective, I sometimes think we count the wrong things as we begin thinking about areas of competition in the world. It's going to be how well systems operate, how well communication operates. We were talking, later in this program about the Space Force, we were already talking about the Space Force actually, and how that is really a function of satellites and managing communications and instruction through a lot of different platforms and systems. So hopefully we can continue that conversation with Secretary Del Toro, because I think that's the area, and then it raises the questions of how we continue to invest in this revolution in technology in systems. And as I was discussing with the Defense Deputy Secretary, the interconnectivity between all these different dimensions so that communication and instruction travels seamlessly. So let me ask our team, how are we doing? And I'm trying to bring back, here we have the Secretary back. Secretary, are you with us? I do not have the Secretary back. All right, we're going to have to break for a moment, folks, and we will be back in just a moment. Hi, folks. Hopefully we're going to have Secretary Del Toro back with us. There have been some communication problems between us, but I think he already shared some important dimensions of how he views maritime preeminence and some of the big dimensions of competition today, both in terms of Russia and the Ukraine crisis, what's going on amphibiously, and also with China. So I want to thank Secretary Del Toro for his time. Hopefully we'll get him back. That brings us to the end of our first session today. I want to thank Raytheon Missiles and Defense for its support of these conversations. Thank all of you attendees for joining. Take a quick break, get some coffee or lunch, and meet us back here at 2:15 p.m. Eastern. That's about 15 minutes from now, so eat fast. We're going to be kicking off with a panel on China and Russia, and we'll end the hour with an interview with former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and it is fantastic. You won't want to miss these or any of our other important conversations ahead. I need to get some coffee too. We'll be back here at 2:15.